And Haley, the mic is yours.
Awesome. I'll just share my screen here. And thank you guys all for taking some time out of your day to listen to me talk about the media. I know we can kind of be a mysterious breed here. I mean, we don't use Oxford commas for goodness sake. So I appreciate you being willing to listen in. And I honestly think it's going to benefit me as well, because hopefully this will result in some good pitches for me coming from you guys. So thanks again. So obviously I'm going to talk about pitching to the press, but I wanted to start off just with a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. I see a lot of familiar names in the participants, but for those who might be listening in later on, a little bit about me. I've been with Business First for almost 2 years now. And prior to joining Business First, I was the features editor at the Kokomo Tribune in Kokomo, Indiana. It's a metro daily paper just north of Indianapolis. And prior to that, I was at the Mount Carmel Register, which was a tri-weekly publication. And before that, I was a designer and copy editor at the Elkhart Truth in Elkhart, Indiana. So I've actually been working in newspapers since I got my first internship at 16 in high school. And I went to Indiana University for college and got my Bachelor of Arts in Journalism there with a specialization in news writing and news editing. Which was a specialization that we could take for those who were specifically interested more in the print and online space as opposed to broadcast journalism. So that, I know you guys didn't come here to hear me talk about my life story, so let's get right to it. So how do we decide what goes in the news? I think that's a mysterious question that a lot of people who haven't had any media training at all don't really know the answer to. So honestly, these are our guiding principles that they teach you in Journalism 101. So I'm giving you guys a little Journalism 101 refresher here. So these are called the 7 news values. And honestly, they vary kind of a little bit between on who you ask, but I would say these are the 7 core values that we go by. So impact, the more people a story would impact, the more news value it has for us. Timeliness, the more recently a story happened is more news value for us. Proximity, we always care about news that's happening locally in our town and not 900 miles away, unless it has a local tie to it. Prominence, so we care about big companies, CEOs, names of folks or celebrities, for more community news based local celebrities and other news about that. The bizarre is a really interesting one that I don't get to cover so much anymore now that I'm out of community news, but the bizarre was like a abnormality that happened in the community, like, a 2-headed cow is born or something like that. That's also, what makes a good story is just something out of the ordinary happening. Conflict, it's one that nobody really likes to write about, but it's honestly one that's probably the most well read, is anytime people are having conflicting viewpoints on a specific subject. And then the last one is currency, and we're not talking about money currency, but that could be relevant to this topic. We're talking about currency as a trend, essentially, or why a story is relevant right now. So for example, trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but something to do with like the coronavirus's impact. Obviously that's been a trend story and it's been pervasive in the news world since last March. So anything that has to do that's on trend with reporting on that topic is, that currency value. So I would say generally, when you are thinking about the 7 news values, the 3 that apply the most regularly, the ones that we're writing about the most often, is impact, timeliness, and proximity. I would say proximity and timeliness are the 2 key ones there, as well as impact, but we really care if something happened recently and if it happened locally. Those are like the 2 thresholds to get your story in the local news. So I just wanted to touch on this as well. Media outlets prioritize their news values in different ways. So I would say, depending on what publication that you want to go to, we're all looking for different things. So for example, broadcast stations favor news that has a strong visual element. And I kind of put some examples of like news values that usually applies to in parentheses there. But for example, I know WDRB just did a nice story on Care Mobile and Render Capital's investment, and it had a nice visual video element to go with it. So broadcast stations, when you're pitching to them, always think about what visual elements that you can offer them, or video interview opportunities. For newspapers, especially like the Courier Journal, or another local publication like the News and Tribune, we focus exclusively on local, regional, or state news, and all of our national news is almost always aggregated from the Associated Press or the New York Times or something like that, depending on what kind of partnerships they have. So if your news is, if you're trying to pitch to someone out of the state to a local newspaper, they likely won't bite unless there's a specific local tie. And just to touch on business journals like Business First, our publication is owned by American City Business Journals based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. We have 44 different business journals in kind of all of the major markets across the US. The closest one to us is in Cincinnati, but we also have one in Nashville as well, and kind of all of the major metros there. But so our business journal publications always give precedence to companies, company executives, and community leaders, as well as anything that has to do with money. So I would say we prioritize that prominence and impact, outside of the proximity and timeliness as well too, because we care about what CEOs are saying, as well as anytime money is changing hands. That's news. That's a news value for us. And all online publications prioritize breaking news above anything else. So timeliness is key. So if it's an online only publication, you have to think about getting the news out quickly. That's their biggest goal, because that's the biggest advantage of being an online publication, is that you can get the news out first before anyone else. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on national news outlets. While they adhere to the same news values as most generally anyone else, they aren't necessarily looking for stories. Most likely they have a story already in mind and they're looking for sources. So they're following these trend stories that can impact readers across the nation. For example, the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests and, other current events that are happening, not just in Louisville or somewhere else, but they're impacting a nation. So they're honestly looking for people who can, add a voice into a national trend that they've been covering. So those are some thoughts on kind of what I think are the main folks that you guys might be pitching to. So finding your angle, I think, is the biggest challenge or the biggest hurdle that I've heard from entrepreneurs, just, talking and passing with them about, creating pitches and that type of thing. So first, you just have to identify, what news you want to share. We're always trying to find that news hook. So it could be anything from a completed fundraise, product launches, new innovative tech that people haven't heard about, new executives or key hires. Anytime a company goes on a hiring spree or has some major growth, we're very interested in that. And, honestly, something that I thought I would be writing more about leading into 2021 that I haven't yet is pivots and, strategy and different things that have happened as a result of the coronavirus. So I am hoping to get more of those stories. So if you have one, my contact information will be available at the end of this. So feel free to reach out to me. But I think, with whatever story that you're pitching, you got to think about who you want to pitch to and why. And for business journals, I mean, honestly, our publication caters specifically to business professionals and folks who work in businesses. So we want to know why this would be of interest to our readers. How is it going to enhance their knowledge base of the business community, or, help further their own business? So that's probably why, Business First writes more about B2B businesses versus B2C, because while we do write to consumers on my restaurant beat and retail beat, I would say most generally we care about, businesses that are offering services to other businesses. So that's a point within who you should pitch to and why. But if it's more of a general news story, like the consumer or the human interest type of stories, I think any other community news outlet would be interested in that, whether it's the Courier Journal, WDRB, Wave 3, one of the TV stations. It kind of just depends on what angle you're trying to pitch there. So I wanted to run through just a couple of examples for you guys, because I think examples are helpful in understanding what exactly we're looking for. And these are specifically my examples, stories that I've written about and why they interested me. And so other reporters might have some other ideas depending on who you talk to, but I at least wanted to give you guys a look at some of the folks that I've talked to and what made me interested in their story. So T2 Software, I actually met T2 Software's CEO, Tim Riley, back in, gosh, that would have been February of 2020, which feels like a decade ago at this point. So we actually met for coffee just so I could learn a little bit more about his business back then. And we didn't keep in touch very much during the pandemic, but when Tim reached out to me a couple of months ago saying that they signed a major licensing agreement with an international company, that like rang a bell in my mind. Like this company has a really interesting story, and it would be really interesting for Business First to have a nice feature story on. And then he came back to me and said, "Oh yeah, and we got $1 million investment." So there were two news hooks there. But I also pitched it to my editors as a feature opportunity because T2 Software, if you guys didn't catch the profile, was founded by the folks who were involved in Stone Street 1, which was acquired by Qualcomm back, I guess that was 2014, 2015. Can't remember the exact year, but it's a really interesting story. And so props to all of that all the way around. It was really interesting to write about. So this is one of the few pitches that I've received that has to do with some sort of a pivot. So the news angle at first for me was the fact that Feet to the Fire Writers Workshops, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Angela, but she's such a sweet person. Her business pivoted from a B2B type of business because previously she would sell her writers, she would license out her writers kits and other things to long-term care facilities and nursing homes and other things like that. But with all of those shutting down due to the coronavirus pandemic and not allowing outside visitors in, not allowing residents to interact with each other, she ultimately decided to create a consumer model. So she went B2C and created individual kits that she could sell and have virtual groups and different things. So I thought it was a pretty interesting pivot. But I also thought, going back to the currency news value that we talked about, I thought it was really interesting about how her company was trying to combat social isolation created by the pandemic, because older populations are, they were isolated before the pandemic, and it's even worse now when many of those folks are in high-risk communities and can't get out and can't see their friends or their family. So it was really, kind of this solution story of, maybe we can't get them out, but we can get, them feeling that creative spark again and bring some light back into their life. So I was really interested in that as well. So Dion Stokes, I know Amplify is familiar with Dion, and I'm sure some of the folks on this call as well are as well, but she is the founder of New Age Communications, and I have written about her previously, but this story actually came to me through Google. I had a Google PR person reach out to me about their Google for Startups Black Founders Exchange, which is in its fifth year now. So a new company that she co-founded with another woman, PVT, pronounced Pivot, was started as a result of the pandemic. And it was just a really interesting story, about a new company being admitted into what's essentially an accelerator / network program. And anytime a startup or another company is, selected for an incubator, accelerator, any kind of national programming, or is getting that national recognition, it's something that I'm interested in. And so lastly, I wanted to highlight my ongoing Innovators and Entrepreneurs profile series. It's a series that I've headed up since July of 2019. We used to do bi-weekly profiles on the entrepreneur community, and then we ended up switching to a once a month format just because of the coronavirus pandemic, and it was harder to get people way back in July, but I can definitely see it bumping back up to bi-weekly. But it's really similar to Business First in-person profiles, where we kind of just highlight a local executive and their career history. So Innovators and Entrepreneurs is in that similar format where I have a narrative and we have a Q&A with the founder. But really this is a way for entrepreneurs to get coverage, to get introductions into the business community without having a specific news angle in mind, which I think is key here. So if you still think that you have a really interesting story or have really interesting things to share, you should reach out and just touch base, because I'm always looking for folks who could be profile opportunities for Business First. So it doesn't have to have a specific angle. You don't have to have a $1 million fundraise or a high accelerator program or a licensee agreement. You can just be you and have a really interesting company that you think would be worthy of being profiled in Business First. So that's always something to keep in mind, is just to get yourself on my radar, another reporter's radar, about potential source opportunities, potential profile opportunities moving forward. So to do that, I think making connections is key. So establishing relationships with the media before you ever pitch a story is ideally the way you want to do it, because it already puts you on our radar and we remember you from those earlier conversations. So I wrote down some do's and don'ts, and obviously this is word heavy. I'm word focused, so apologies if you're having to do a lot of reading right now, but I'll go through these. So you should do some research and figure out who you should be talking with. Most reporters all have their beats, and if you've never heard of beats before, it's kind of just our coverage area, like what specific topics that we focus on. So for me, like I said, it's restaurants, retail, tech, and entrepreneurs. And for my colleagues, we have a commercial real estate reporter, we have a healthcare reporter. We kind of have everyone spread out so that we're all not overworked trying to do multiple things at once. So go and check out the publication's website that you're interested in being featured in. Read through the reporter's bio information, and then see who you should be talking with, like where your company aligns best. You should also try to read a few of that reporter's stories, just to, check out their style, see what things they've previously covered, and mention that you've read some of their stuff and liked what they did. So it kind of puts you, like I said, it puts you on their radar for future opportunities. This is one of my do nots. Don't randomly email editors because you think that they're at the top of the food chain. They are, and they're too busy to honestly respond to a lot of the pitch emails that they get. So if they don't happen to read an email and forward it on to a reporter, it gets lost in the shuffle, because I guess I should have touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but the way most news media organizations operate now is that reporters actually pitch stories to editors, and then editors essentially gives them the thumbs up and say, you can pursue that. It's not editors anymore, for the most part, going out and assigning specific stories to reporters. It's our jobs to find interesting stories and bring them to the publication. So reporters are who you should be going to. One of the do's is engaging with journalists. This kind of goes along with reading their stories, but I would recommend, connecting with them on LinkedIn, following them on Twitter, emailing them, just saying like, hey, I thought this story was really interesting. If you're looking to do any future articles about this, I can be a source. So do not, one of the do nots that we try to instill in everyone is that we have a really hard deadlines to meet all the time, and most of us are working on 3 or 4 stories a day, unless there's some kind of investigative reporter, which honestly have been few and far between, because of media cutbacks. um, but most of us general news reporters, we're out here writing 3 or 4 stories a day, following up with multiple sources a day. So if you're pitching a story, please make yourself as accessible as possible. If we give you a deadline for when you need to get, a question answered for us, please adhere to it, because it makes it very difficult to, time manage for us as well. So for reasons mentioned above, do send follow-up emails. It's really easy for us to lose track of things in the daily news grind. As Mike can probably attest to, he had to circle back with me a couple times just getting me on this on this presentation, because he would send me an email back. I would be like, oh, that's Mike, I need to respond to him, work on a story. And then he'd have to circle back with me, because there's just things that pile up, and we need those follow-up emails to keep it fresh in our mind. And we promise we will always respond at some point. And hopefully that's within a couple of days. So if you sent a pitch and haven't gotten a response in a few days, just circle back. I would give it 2 to 3 days, but usually we'll always respond even if we're not interested in the story. So a few more media building tips. You should offer exclusive content. Most of us don't want to write the same story another publication wrote the day before. That's just, it doesn't add much value to our publication when, we're all covering the same things. So Business First is a subscriber-based publication where, we have a lot of folks paying for our content versus, on a television news station or a television website, folks don't hit paywalls. So there's not really a need for readers to come to Business First for that news if they can get it at a TV station. And it doesn't just have to be Business First if you're looking to pitch to other folks as well. But we always enjoy having exclusive content because it adds value for our readers. This is probably a really big do not, and we don't get this a whole lot, honestly, but it's kind of a warning. Don't mislead reporters. Don't embellish the truth or offer unsubstantiated claims. What happens is once we figure out that something like that has happened, we have to go back and do more research and dig, essentially. A good example of this was one of my colleagues, Chris Larson, did a story on U of L, and it might have been the hospital, I have to go back, but they reported their financial information. He figured out that this wasn't necessarily misleading or embellishing on their part. I'm not trying to say that, but he figured out that the financial information that they released was far different than the actual amount that came out later. So he had to go and backtrack all of this through public records. So it was actually it turned out to be a really interesting story, but it wasn't a good thing for U of L. So moving on to the next one, do bring added value to the relationship. And honestly, I think I get the most benefit out of this from the startup community, because everyone that I've talked with has been so willing to connect me with other people, and has just been really receptive to helping me get more stories. So making introductions is really awesome. Sharing information that doesn't specifically have to do with your company. It could just be as simple as like, hey, I saw this restaurant open up near my house, in my circumstance, or just some other news that you notice that you haven't seen in Business First that might be worthy for us to cover. And then offer updates on industry trends. So honestly, it's a lot of work for reporters to keep up with national trends all the time. And we try to for the most part, but there could be a trend that's happening in your industry that is just going right over our heads. And we need someone like you to step in and be like, hey, we really think that this is an important topic for Business First to cover. I'm happy to be a source on it, or happy to offer you more insights into, how this is impacting my business. So a good example of this that's outside of the startup world, but I have been keeping up with local breweries and what's been going on with Senate Bill 15. which was a bill that would allow small microbrewers to self-distribute up to 2,500 gallons of beer themselves, which was a big deal because previously they'd have to go through distributors. And honestly, I would have never known about this bill because I don't cover Frankfurt. I don't cover legislation very often. Um, it was through the Kentucky Guild of Brewers. So I checked in with the executive director of that organization, and we were talking about something separate, which is a part of the stimulus bill and the federal excise tax. And he mentioned, "Hey Haley, we're pushing to get self distribution passed through legislation this year. So passed through the General Assembly, excuse me." So those types of industry trends that are really important to the industry, we want to tell those stories. And if you want to offer yourself up as a source, that's just really helpful for us. And so one of the last do not that I have for you is expect journalists to know everything. And this has happened to me a couple times, throughout my career, is just really technical subjects. And honestly, they might think that I'm smarter than I am. uh, and I try to keep up to date with everything that I can. And, I can certainly go back and read definitions, but we're human. And even if something is like really well known to you, it might not be something that, a journalist has heard of, especially if you're talking about something that happened 10 years ago and they're 28 years old and we're still in high school at that time. So just, keep that in mind, when you're trying to explain something to journalists, just assume that they don't know anything about it, because we honestly want to hear you describe it. Even if we know what's going on, we want to hear you describe it in your own words, so that we can get a better grasp of, just what the situation is. And so the last to do is offer yourself as a source for a timely topic. So for example, I'm currently writing a story or hoping to write a story about startups that are getting funds from angel investors through Kentucky's relaunched Angel Investment Tax Credit Program, which was discontinued and just restarted this year. And so that could be a source, or that could be an opportunity for you to say, "Oh, hey, I'm getting angel investment, and my angel investors are coming from here, and I want to share how this has benefited my company." You can just reach out on that. But honestly, you're not going to know necessarily what types of timely topics the reporters like myself are, pursuing at the time. So if you see something happening and you think that you could offer some valuable insights into that, just send an email and say, "Hey, I don't know if this is something that you're writing about, but I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think that I could add some value to the story." And that gets you plugged in as a source, even if the story is, a broader story than just focusing on your company specifically. So press release writing, and I think a lot of folks are pretty good at this. I don't get very many bad press releases from the startup community, mostly because not very many folks are writing them, and those that do kind of have a grasp on how to do it or have hired someone to do it for them. But honestly, I love PR executives and they keep me on top of things, but it's something that you can easily do yourself with a little bit of research and a little bit of time, which isn't something that everyone has. So if you don't have that, think about making that investment into the PR space or the marketing space to get someone who can do these things for you and do them easily and well. So include the biggest tips that I can offer for press release writing is include a Louisville or Southern Indiana dateline. And by dateline, I mean at the beginning of your press release, put Louisville KY dash, and then start your press release there. And then mention that your company is based, if you don't put a dateline, mention that your company is based in Louisville or in Southern Indiana, just so that we have that frame of reference for the proximity news value. So in the first sentence or in the headline of the release, you need to tell us why we should care about this news and why now. Honestly, the worst press releases that we get are, it takes us 4 paragraphs to read through before we even get to what the news is. And that's just a hassle for us. It's not necessarily a huge problem, but it's best if you put like the main news that you're trying to get out there in the headline or the first sentence. And play it straight. I mean, don't use a bunch of industry jargon or buzzwords that we hear a lot, whether it's kind of in these demo day pitches or pitches to investors. I think investors really like buzzwords, but journalists, we write words for a living, and they don't really impress us as much as they might other folks. So it honestly kind of just muddles up, the focus of your news. So if you can just play it as straight as possible, that's what I would recommend, as opposed to using a bunch of words like innovative and industry leading and that type of thing. So referencing your background and how the company was founded is helpful, especially if we haven't heard of you before or haven't written about you before. A lot of us will go back to our archives and check to see if we've written about this company before. If so, what do we know about as executive? So this is just research that we typically do on our own. But if we haven't ever written about you before, including background info and more information on how the company was founded can help us offer that context to our readers. And some other items to include, and these might be really self-explanatory or common sense, but include at least one direct quote with attribution from a founder or CEO or another C-level executive. And by direct quote, I mean something that they want to say about the news that we can attribute to them. So it's what we have in quotation marks throughout the stories, but any available numbers is helpful, such as an employee count, any fundraising figures, annual revenue. I'm trying to think of a couple of other examples off the top of my head, but numbers also help add context to the readers, going back to that background and information that we're trying to offer. We also want to be able to give people an idea of just, the size of your business, the scope of your business, and that type of thing. And then the last thing is to include, contact information for someone that can answer questions quickly. And this is key because if it's breaking news, like if, for an example, I'm trying to think of something on the fly, but if a big company in Louisville, like Ski Vault or El Toro acquires another company, a smaller company, and that's breaking news for us. If there's a question that we have, we want to be able to get it answered, very quickly so that we can get the news out as fast as possible, which isn't always the case in all situations. If it's not a breaking news story, we can take our time with it and take time with follow-up questions, but contact information for someone that can quickly follow up with you and get back to you with what you need to get the story out there fast is very helpful. So examples of good and bad press pitches. I always like giving people examples because I feel like I ramble a little bit and examples are a little bit more concrete. So this is from a Austin-based tech company that I obviously haven't written about, but wanted to use them as a good example for what to do. So within that, this is what's good about it. They used my first name, spelled it right, instead of just saying hello there or something impersonal. They actually used my name and got it right. And then within the first sentence of this email pitch, they get right to the point, tell me everything that I need to know, and then they linked the press release right below that. They included the background information that I was talking about earlier, and included some facts and figures and details about that. They also offered up an interview with the founder or the CEO, which I can understand, if folks are busy, that's not something that's always possible, but it's really great if we can talk to them and kind of make our own stamp on the news instead of having to just rewrite a press release. We're always interested in telling our own story. So offering up yourself or someone else with your organization is always something that we're interested in. And then I subtracted a few points, not that I have an actual point system, but they didn't tell me where the company was based. It was something that I had to go look up and make sure it wasn't, a Louisville based company or somewhere around Louisville. Okay, so let's talk about the bad. And this is a really funny example. Um, so it starts off with, hey there, they don't know me. They're probably just sending emails to a bunch of people all at once. I have no idea what this story is supposed to be about, the company or anything, the entrepreneur, or in this case, a lifestyle influencer. But in the first graph, it's like, have you ever been struggling with your marriage or thinking about getting a divorce? Just don't ask personal questions of the reporter in your pitch email. Not that that ever happens or any of you have thought about that, but the key here is there's no personalization. I don't really know what the story is about other than the fact that it's about marriage and divorces, and they want to know if I've ever thought about one. So I thought that was just really funny and kind of a good example of what not to do. So I actually stole this example online that I've seen circulated on Twitter several times throughout my career. But I thought it's a good example of, again, what not to do. So this person supposedly used the wrong name. We don't know who they are. What's the news? What's the context? We don't know any of that within the first sentence. And then they linked a release. It didn't really explain what the news was about. And honestly, I think this reporter just felt like the person had no idea what they write about. So just keep that in mind. It goes back to, doing your research, being genuine and personable, and including all of the pertinent details at the beginning of the paragraph. Okay, so I think I'm quickly approaching 45 minutes here, but I wanted to open it up for Q&A. And feel free to ask me questions about stuff that I didn't cover in this. If you just have, general questions about the news industry, I've been in it for almost 6 years now, so happy to weigh in on any other topics that you're interested in.
That was awesome, Haley.
Thank you.
Feel free to unmute yourself for any questions.
Hey, Haley, this is Chris Wiedmar. It's been a while. Good to hear you again. Quick question for you, I guess, from a local standpoint, and I know obviously you're coming from the Business First perspective, but what stories have you seen have the most traction and eyeballs on it? And obviously kind of slanting that more towards like the tech startup and obviously some early stage technology companies. I'd be curious to see where you guys are getting the most readership from, if there's general themes around that.
Yeah, so honestly, I feel like we get a lot of readership from business executives who are, within larger companies that maybe don't have the ability to be as innovative as they'd like to be, but still want to hear about those new technologies. So I feel like, a lot of our readership, since they are in that executive level role, most of the time within a larger company, is coming for our tech information through those means. But it doesn't mean that it's not of interest, kind of to more of a general audience as well. But I would say, most of the folks who are reading our tech startup, innovation news are, from these larger companies who are just interested in what folks are working on locally. I hope that's helpful. If you want some more metrics, feel free to send me an email because I can actually pull up our metrics on our site and see where our traffic is coming from.
Awesome. Thank you. That'd be great.
Can I jump in here? All right, sweet. Hi, Haley. Thanks for the presentation. Just I guess the side question. I feel like all the news articles about startups have been mostly about, at least the ones that I keep seeing right in front of me is like, X startup raised so many millions, X startup raised so many millions. I feel like a lot of reporters jumped the wagon on, hey, let's just get the news out that the startup has raised money. And so it's like a constant cycle of seeing the same article, just different startups, different money. And the bigger the amounts, the sexier the story, right? Raised 100 million or whatever it is. I guess how do you start to differentiate and make it interesting for your readers, for startups, in a community that, let's face it, is not going to raise that many millions unless your app harvest doing an aspect. But so how do you get that out, and how as a reporter you find that challenging, and where can we help you on that end?
Yeah. And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, so much of startup reporting is focused on fundraising. And I mean, our Boston market does a Form D Friday where they just like go through who's raising money and how much they've raised. But I, coming from a small town myself and, working in Louisville for 2 years, I kind of understand that, fundraising news isn't the end all be all in Louisville for as what would constitute as an interesting news story for us. So I think the key here is just to think about the entry point for readers, like why is this story relevant to our readers and why is it relevant now? So we're always looking for a way to get readers into the story and let them know why we're giving them this information. And most of the time, we're just looking for something that the company has done recently. And it doesn't have to be a fundraise. It doesn't have to be an accelerator. It could be something as, um, you know, simple as launching a new product, which that's not simple, but it could be something like launching a new product, expanding their reach into other markets. It could be, hiring, whether it's, adding a co-founder, adding people to your executive team, or just adding, increasing staff, I think is always an interesting angle. So we're always just looking for, ways to tell readers like, this is why you should care about this company right now. It's just a way we have to have that relevancy factor to get an entry point into that story so people can understand it a little bit better. I hope that helps.
That's great. Thanks.
And so if I heard that right, it's those first two sentences right after Louisville, Kentucky. That's the part to really get the hook, get the draw.
Yeah, that is where you reel us in. And if you can write two sentences and fully explain what's going on and why we should care about it, we're in. We'll email you right back as soon as we can. If we're working on something else, if you got a good news hook, we'll be right there with you. But and honestly, the news hook aspect, I go through all these news values, and I'm hoping that you guys kind of understand where we're coming from when we're talking about these stories. But news can be anything, and that's what I've learned throughout my career, is that every single person that I've talked to has an interesting story. It doesn't matter if you grew up in some small town and don't have this big name attached to you, or aren't working for a Fortune 500 company or anything like that. Like, every single person I talk to has a really interesting story. And I think what we're just looking for is, like I mentioned previously, we're looking for a way to tell that story, and let people know why we're telling it now. And honestly, that's why we do these profiles too. If someone doesn't have a specific news item to share, or something that's recently happened within their company, we're using these profiles as a way to just tell people more about the entrepreneurs, or about their businesses, just so because we think they're interesting. It's not that we ever think that something that you pitch to us isn't interesting. We're just trying to find the best way to get readers into the story.
Are you guys talking about your readers? Do you know how many are outside of the Louisville, Indiana area?
Yeah, so we actually have a way to track where our traffic is coming from, not just geographically, but like also what websites they're using, or mobile apps and that type of thing. So honestly, our biggest readership outside of the Louisville area is Atlanta. Atlanta is our second biggest market, which is kind of unusual. You would think it would be, Nashville or Indianapolis or something like that, but it's Atlanta. And I think it's mostly because of UPS and the World Port. But that's not always the case. But we do have a lot. That's our second biggest readership market. I think Indianapolis is the third, and then Nashville would be the fourth. But it's still kind of regionally focused. We do get some traffic from Cincinnati, but we also have a business journal in Cincinnati that picks up a lot of our content that, you know, we share across platforms. Like they pick up our Kentucky Derby stuff, and we pick up their Kroger stuff. So we share content across platforms. So since Cincinnati is so close to us, we actually don't get a lot of cross traffic from their platform. Does that help in terms of where our
Yeah.
readership is coming from, or were you more interested in you know, specific industries and that type of thing?
No, I think geography, that's kind of really interesting that Atlanta is the
Yeah.
second largest.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, but it still holds true. I remember them telling me that when I, you know, first started, and I was like, that seems weird. But it is, and we still, Atlanta is usually our second biggest market consistently every month. First it's Louisville, obviously, with the biggest readership share, but then we get, you know, a fourth of our traffic coming from Atlanta.
Haley, to build off that question, in one of the previous sessions a few weeks ago with Florida League Communications, they mentioned, at least for, this might be like actual video news stories, but they mentioned that national projections will actually take local stories. So the best way to get your updates and your news to a national audience, they say to go through your local stations. Is the same kind of situation for copy and for those types of articles?
So honestly, you know, I think that's a really interesting insight. And I just saw an example of this happen today. One of my editors shared a Forbes article with me that talked about Louisville's budding entrepreneurial ecosystem. And it actually referenced a lot of topics that we've like previously written about, but it seems like the national reporter who is working on this Forbes article, I don't want to talk trash about anybody, but it seems like they sourced their stories from previous news reports that, you know, not just Business First has covered, but maybe other local media outlets. It's like they used all of our stories for context, didn't really talk to anyone locally. So I would say that does hold true. Like national outlets I would say they find good sources and find good people through these local sites. Or, you know, now it seems like it's increasing that, you know, folks are finding people on Twitter and other social media platforms. So a good example of that is CNN found the owner of Meta Bar, you know, in downtown Louisville, and talked with him about bar and restaurant restrictions in Kentucky and why, you know, he's with Governor Bashir on it. So CNN found a bar owner in little Louisville, Kentucky, through Twitter. So I think it's a combination of checking through local sources, who's giving, you know, really good quotes, really good information, and then also, you know, the social media aspect, by engaging with reporters through social media.
And hey, Mike, it's Bill Shorey. I'll just jump in on that and clarify. And thanks, Haley. You know, what we were really pushing there is the idea that if Haley does a story, now you've got something that you can take to a national outlet and say, look, you know, here's a local outlet did this story, and it's a good example of the story that we have to tell. And in general, you know, a reporter is going to do a really nice job of shaping that in a form that a journalist is really going to be able to see the story within it. So if you've got a professional storyteller like Haley who is going to create a narrative around your story, that's going to be a great tool for you as you pitch your story to other folks.
Yeah, and adding on to that, I totally agree with that viewpoint of, you know, it makes the biggest benefit for press releases for us is it kind of lays out what the story is without us having to do a bunch of you know, extra work. But along for national media outlets, it also adds that validation. You know, if you get coverage from you know, like the Courier Journal or from us or from one of the television news stations, it's a way for your business to be validated in the eyes of the national media outlet. And also many local outlets are connected through networks like I would say, just an example, we're owned by American City Business Journals, Courier Journal's owned by USA Today or Gannett. And so they're always, we're always sharing stories across our platform. So if something has, a tie to another market, like it's very easy for, the Cincinnati Business Courier to take my story and republish it on their site. So, and we have a national site as well, just like USA Today does. So it's really important to rely heavily on your local journalists, not just because we live in the same communities as you do and we care about the stuff that you care about, but also we're a great way to get your story out there and create content that you can share with other bigger publications to say, hey, this is my story. And I think it would be a value for your publication as well if you talk to me about X, Y, and Z.
Haley, can you touch on? Haley, can you touch on real quick? Like, I'm just curious, from your perspective. Obviously, I think Business First does a great job of focusing on business and technology. And maybe this is more of, I don't know if it's a Louisville question or a national question, but like I see, I get the Wall Street Journal every day and they've got a technology section now. Like, why is that not pumped up more? And I don't want to pick on the Courier or local news stations, but like, why is that not a topic? You know what I mean? Like, to me, think about like through COVID, like technology is the reason why everybody kept their minds and didn't go insane. Yeah. You know what I mean? So like, it's in the fabric of our everyday life. Like, why do these organizations not cover it with the same, regularity that like a group like yours does? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I would say for the most part, the biggest reason I would say is because business journals, like I was mentioning before, we're focused on those B2B businesses. So the folks that are offering software and technology solutions to other industries is, kind of our bread and butter of technology reporting. And the reason why it's not applicable to other outlets is likely because they're so focused on, the general reader or the general consumer. They're trying to create content that's, palatable for everybody. And, there's probably not a big slice of their readership that is specifically interested in reading about the technology space. But I've also heard, just in general, business news coverage is so tied to openings and closings. So anything outside of that, it honestly takes a little bit more work. And, with smaller newsrooms, I think people are just looking to get the most bang for their buck when they're writing about the business community. So I think there's a lot of factors that play into that. But I would say the biggest one is that, these other outlets are catering to the consumer while we're catering to businesses. And so that's the difference. Like if you have a tech company that's, software as a service or, just interacting with businesses as opposed to selling your software to consumers or having a consumer facing platform, then that makes it less applicable for like a Courier Journal article, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you.
Jordan Clemens asks, what is the desired length for a press release? And I think that's a great question because, if you get a 4-pager, obviously the likelihood of that getting printed or even read is probably low. What is like the structure? You already mentioned, the first line should have the location and the hook 1 or 2 sentence liner, but like from there, how do you break down the press release and how long should it be?
Yeah, so just generally, press releases should be 1 page. That's how far we're going to read. Is we'll read a 1 page. We might rewrite a 1 page, or we will reach out to you to see if we can, delve more into the story from the release that you sent. But yeah, like you said, 4 pages is really excessive, and we have gotten those before, especially from bigger companies who have like a lot of stuff to put out there all at once. Which is fine, in some cases, but most generally 1 page. And then going back to the structure of what we'd like to see, obviously the most important news goes into the lead. You can add some context in the second paragraph or the second sentence. And then what we talk about in like the second or third paragraph, we call it a nut graph in the journalism world, where it's kind of just the nuts and bolts of everything that we need to know within 1 paragraph. So I would say the first 3 paragraphs that you write are the most important. And then fourth paragraph should be like a direct quote. And this doesn't have to be exact. I'm just giving kind of a general outline. We like to have a quote after we know all of the pertinent information in the first 3 graphs. We'll have a quote, any more background information about how the company is founded. And then that can actually, depending on the length of your release, some companies will write the news that is most interesting. And then at the end, they'll have an about section. They'll be like about Amplify, and then they'll have 2 or 3 sentences explaining what Amplify does. And that's always very helpful as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more context on how to structure those releases.
Yes, thank you. And I think that's super important. If we're ever going to be able to amplify our stories, we should be able to write it right and get it to you right. So thank you for that. I think we have time for one last question to really close it out. Anyone have any pressing last questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Haley. I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on the recording.